We will start our Q&A now. Please give your name and question, and please speak clearly into the mic. Our first question is for Dr. Carrier.
Hi, Dr. Carrier. My name is David Madding. So clearly you believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. However, that necessitates that we are perceiving order, and I think that order implies that there's a mind. I mean, if I looked at a valid argument in sentential logic, it's not unreasonable or absurd for me to think that there's a logician behind that argument. Therefore, why is it absurd to think that there's a conscious order giver to the rational order we perceive? And I think that this is distinct from the teleological arguments that your opponent was making, because it has nothing to do with probability.
Right. I'm not entirely sure. It would have been helpful if you gave an example of what you mean. But it's actually untrue that order implies a mind. In fact, if you take any random series, and certainly a random series long enough, you're going to have order in that series. It's a statistical inevitability. In fact, for example, software engineers have to specifically intelligently design music randomizers to not be random. Because if they let them be random, they'll actually play the same song over and over again or do them in weird sequences. Because statistically, inevitably, that's going to happen. So any random process is going to produce order. So we don't actually need a mind to explain that. And when we look at the history of the universe, what we see is starting from very simple structures, becoming more complex over time by unintelligent interaction. I mean, no intelligence is arranging the events after the Big Bang. Just physics are just running, essentially. So we don't need a mind for that. And the fact that it starts much more simple and becomes complex over time suggests that we have an automatic process running, not some intelligence doing it. If it was an intelligence doing it, we would see much more examples of clear defying of natural physical processes, producing intelligent design without any particular mechanical causation. But we just don't have any examples of that.
Lenny, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I just don't think it's true that given enough time, any possibility can exist. There are certainly certain features or certain arrangements that we would classify as absurd, and mathematicians have a boundary point that they say the odds of something happening beyond, say, 1 to 10 to the 80th. It's an absurd possibility. It's basically impossible. Of course, nothing is ever absolute 0 or absolute 1, but there are points where it's absolutely impossible. Penrose's, for example, concept of the order of the initial conditions of the universe being 1 times 10 to the 120th power falls outside of the range of possibility that most mathematicians would accept. It is beyond multiple universes ever happening to come into existence. So it's just simply not the case that throw enough time at it and it'll be true. There are certain things that'll never happen given enough time.
All right, thank you for your question. Yeah, you can applaud. The next question is for Lenny.
Hi, Mr. Lenny. Most of your arguments were pretty sound, except for the last one, where you talked about the reason for God's existence being the revelation that Paul received. So my question is, why would Paul receive inspiration from Jesus when he was a persecutor of Christians? Like in the text of Paul, he declares himself that he is a liar himself, and there's evidence of this in the Corinthians. His teachings conflicted with many of the original teachings of Jesus Christ. And Paul was declared an infidel by many of the early Christians, and he even demanded financial funding from his followers. It's like Hitler committing a mass genocide of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and then all of a sudden claiming himself to be their apostle.
Okay, well, I don't think it's the case that first of all, I don't believe that Paul's teachings were in contradiction with Christ. I think you'll have to prove that in order to assert it. He was a Pharisee under Gamaliel. He was a righteous Jew, taught that the only pure religion was the Jewish religion, and he felt by persecuting Christians, he was actually doing a good. He wasn't plagued. I don't know where Richard comes up with the idea that he was guilt-racked and plagued. Romans 7 was written after his conversion, after he was a Christian. It's not speaking of him while he was still a Jew. Romans 7 talks about actually the state of wanting to do things I don't want to do because I understand Christ living in me. So Richard kind of misapplies that to meaning before his conversion experience. But Paul was effective. He was an effective tool for the Lord in spreading the gospel to many millions of people. So why not use him? Because it seems to me that he did a very good job of it, and he accomplished the tasks that God would have for him.
Dr. Carrier?
Romans 7, yes, written after his conversion, but the point is that it reveals and explains some of the anxieties he had about the Jewish law. So you can just read it yourself. You can see that he was really bothered by the inability of Jewish law to be a secure way to salvation. So that tells you something about his state of mind and why he preferred Christianity, because that's one of his arguments for Christianity. And often if you're going to see something like that, that's what you're going to see, is they're going to use arguments that they use to convince themselves when they're arguing to other people. And it is true that Paul's teachings contradict Jesus's if you reject the idea that Jesus survived his death. Because it's very clear in Galatians that Paul introduced the idea of abandoning Torah law, that we don't have to be circumcised, we don't have to follow Jewish dietary laws, we don't have to be Jews, basically. But the previous disciples, Peter and James and so forth, had never heard of this. And it's very clear that Paul heard this in his revelation of the risen Jesus. So it was Jesus after his living ministry. So if you're an atheist, of course, obviously he's contradicting the actual earthly historical Jesus, because Jesus died never having said these things. But a Christian would tell you that, well, then he came back and said, oh, by the way, you can get rid of the dietary laws. That's what Paul was selling. That's the thing he was selling. Whether he was dishonest or not, I don't know.
Thank you.
All right, next question is for Dr. Carrier.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Richard. You guys threw around a bunch of big numbers tonight, and one I kept hearing was 10 to the 40th power. And you used that number to indicate the mathematical chance of the simplest life form coming into existence by accident, correct?
That's one of the statistics we have.
Okay, and so you take the stance that that life as we know it started out as an accident. It was not intelligently designed.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so my question, or actually my first question is can you give us an idea of what 10 to the 40th power looks like? I mean, can you give us some kind of libraries or something to that? And secondly, in order for everything that you say to be true, you need an infinite universe, multiple pearls, because there has to be so much time and so much space, because the mathematical odds of what you're proposing are so vast that they wouldn't be possible if there was a finite universe. And if that, so, and now I'm going to just, and no offense, I'm not trying to offend you.
Keep it to 30 seconds.
Sure. Just one thing. So my question, or my bean farmer mentality is what you're proposing is that given enough pearls, I could go back out here in my parking lot to my 2006 Chevy truck, and sooner or later it's going to be a Maserati.
Well, certainly.
Please hold your applause. Let him respond.
Certainly, if you start throwing atoms at each other for infinite amount of time, that would happen. You could get a Maserati, but that's not actually what we're claiming. But first, let's go back to the beginning of what you said. 10 to the power of 40 is 10 with 40 zeros after it. So you think it's a really big number. The Borel's threshold, my opponent mentioned these thresholds that we have, 10 to the power of the 80, he mentioned one. The Borel threshold is 10 to the power of 50. The Dembski threshold is 10 to the power of 150. These are the probabilities that things can happen by chance. If you have an event that can occur 1 in 10 to the power of 40 times, and there can be at least one event in this universe that can occur to a probability of 1 in 10 to the 50, then that means there's going to be 1 in 10 to the 10, so that's 10 with 10 zeros after it. There are going to be that many instances of life originating by accident if the probability is 10 to the power of 40. So the math, once you look at the math, the universe is so vast that even though 10 with 40 zeros after it is such a small, or such a huge number, and such a huge improbability, the universe is even mind-bogglingly bigger than that. So that's why we don't have a problem with that. And we don't want to confuse cosmogenesis with biogenesis. That 10 to the power of 40 is the probability of a molecule, a self-replicating molecule arising by random chemical reactions. That's not, and we don't need an infinitely large universe. We just need a big enough one. And like 10 to the power of 50 events in it, for example, is a big enough universe. The cosmological argument is a whole other thing. So there's a question of we can't even calculate how likely it is that we would have a finely tuned, or that we'd have a universe that could produce life. Because we don't even know all the possible universes that we can invent in which there would be life. I mean, our universe is one particular kind of universe, but there's universes that unimaginable to us that could produce life of a very different kind, but could have consciousness and so on. And there are literally infinite number of variables. We can't calculate this number. So we have no idea what the probability is. All we do know is that the evidence is exactly what we would expect if it was a chance accident, because we can predict the evidence from that, but it's not exactly what we'd expect if a God did it.
All right. Two things to remember. I'm going to allow Lenny to counter-respond, but number one, 30 seconds on the question. It's not a dialogue, but a question time. Number two, 2 minutes to the first response, and then 1 minute to the counter-response. All right, Lenny?
Okay. A couple of things here. One of the things you have to ask in these chance scenarios is that these chemicals can, by chance, randomly come together. I always ask, what about the n+1 factor? If they can chance bond, can't they chance be broken apart by another random accident? What makes them stay together? If the odds are so strange that they may come together, then what about the n+1 theory where something else happens and they break apart? That's highly more likely that they wouldn't stay in these stable relationships before life exists. And again, it's right. You have to start asking about these things. At what point does a man throwing a roll of dice saying, wow, 100 sevens in a row, I guess I'm just happen to be in the universe where that guy's throwing 100 sevens in a row. Or maybe he says, wow, I bet you those dice are loaded. Someone's got the fix in. We recognize intelligence, and we have to have a way to discern that. I gave you reasons for that they're complex, that they're systematized, they're set to do a specific function, and that there's no reason for them to be that way. This is how we recognize that intelligent things exist. It's how we recognize a cave drawing versus a burn mark on a wall. It's how we recognize that somebody writes, I love you on the sand as opposed to a seagull walking by. We recognize intelligence by these patterns. For what Richard's saying is we don't have any way to recognize intelligence. We just have to say it's all by chance because there was a very long time.
All right. Next question is for Lenny.
Hello, my name's Marcus Lang. First of all, I wanted to say I thought you were a fantastic orator, even though I disagree with you. I wanted to ask you, one of the first things you said was that Richard had to prove that God, he needed to prove that God doesn't exist, And I wanted to ask, why is that the case? Even if he didn't provide evidence, why does the burden of proof lay there? If that were the case, I could ask you, do you disbelieve, can you prove that there's no flying spaghetti monster? Can you prove there's no Easter bunny?
Sure.
Or, can you prove that? And if you can't, why does the burden of proof lay there?
Okay, and that's a fair question. I appreciate it. One of the things that one of my points was that when you presume atheism, when you presume there is no God, you're making a positive claim about the state of the universe. Philosopher Anthony Kennedy said that the most one could be without evidence for or against such a proposition is an agnostic. He states that it takes more effort to show that you know something than to show that you just simply don't know it. And this even includes the claim that the idea of God is not coherent. So you're making a claim that the idea of God is not coherent. That's a positive claim. You need to prove that. You mentioned things like the flying spaghetti monster. Well, these are easy to prove. The flying spaghetti monster is a being that has physical space, matter. It experiences time. So it can't be the thing that originates the universe. You notice that Richard never said how we get something from nothing. He talked about quantum vacuums and quantum fluctuations. Well, these aren't nothing. You have energy changing. That's what a quantum fluctuation is. Well, now you have change, which is time, and you have energy. Those are two of the things that are created. Those are two of the parts of the universe. So you can't say the universe was created by energy and time when energy and time are two of the things that you're trying to explain.
Response, Dr. Curry?
Yeah. First of all, he was asking about whether the spaghetti monster exists, not whether it created the universe. That's a significant point, which relates to the whole issue of burden of evidence and so on. I don't need to prove that there's no Bigfoot to say that you have to prove that, or otherwise I just don't have any reason to believe it. And atheism is really that, is don't have any reason to believe it. But this does come down to prior probabilities, like if you could establish that there are a lot of big feet, if you want to call it. If we knew there were a lot of these and someone said, well, there's one in our forest, well, then you would, well, there could be. I don't know, we should go look. But since we've never found any, we conclude that there isn't. And it's the same kind of thing with God. We've never found any really good evidence that there is a God at all. So the prior probability is low, so you need really good evidence on that. Had the things turned out differently, if we had much better evidence for God over time, the burden would be on the atheist, but that's not the case. And by the way, I did say how you get something from nothing. Like I said, if you have absolutely nothing, you have no rules governing what's going to happen. So in fact, it's actually inevitable that something will come from it.
Thank you.
Right. Next question is for Dr. Carrier.
Hello, you two. Thank you so much for putting this on for all of us. I have a question for you. When Hitler committed the atrocious act of genocide on millions of people, his philosophy was that he wanted to prolong and preserve the life of a certain race at the expense of another. This correlates with the evolutionary concept of survival of the fittest. Although, of course, it wasn't a natural sequence of events. You said, Richard, that to be compassionate is a more fulfilling way of life. So we know that you're not down with the crazed Austrian. Well, Richard, from an evolutionary scientific standpoint, how is what Hitler did objectively wrong?
Well, first of all, evolution is not a moral guide, by the way. Evolution doesn't give a shit about you. Oh, I'm sorry about saying things. I apologize for my colored language, but we don't actually guide our conduct by looking at how nature treats people. Nature treats people really miserably and badly, so nature is a terrible guide on this. The reason why we don't want a world with genocides in it is because, well, for one of many reasons, is that we don't want to be genocided. If Hitler could try and commit a genocide against the Jews could turn around and try to commit a genocide against the Germans. Where does that get us? That gets us nowhere. And the other reason is that if you're going to be genociding someone, that means you have to actually have cultivated a life when you have no compassion or very little compassion for other people. And that life is going to be far less fulfilling and far less happiness-inducing. And it's going to create a dysfunctional society. It's not like Nazi society was all that great. And you wouldn't want to live in it, basically. And the Nazis themselves, who perpetrated this, would have had more fulfilling and more satisfying lives had they gone a different direction and become Quakers, for example, or secular humanists like myself. So that's the reason for it. I mean, I could give you the explanation of how our brains came into that state so that we can actually live that way, but the basic gist of it, the short of it, is that we wouldn't even exist here if we didn't have compassion and love and these other emotions. If we didn't evolve those things, we would have killed each other off long ago, which is basically the answer to your question. It's like, if we want to live together and get along and not kill each other, well, then Hitler is obviously not the model to follow, by the way, died burning in a ditch. I'll just add that.
Lenny?
Yes, this highlights my point. Again, there's a confusion between true objective morality, which sits outside and above humanity, versus objective morality of what you want to be compassionate. You want to live in a society of happiness. Here's a great example. Was the meteor that supposedly slammed into the earth and killed all of the dinosaurs, was that a moral or immoral act? Well, to answer such a thing is a ridiculous question. It doesn't make sense. But what about two firefighters who run in and save a 70-year-old paraplegic out of a burning building, and they both lose their lives as a result? You see, personal happiness and even the advancement of the species, the firefighters could do much more good if they were to continue to be alive. The old paraplegic, he's going to die anyway. The example I gave previously was not just anybody harvesting their organs, but people who are on death row. Why don't we just kill them that way and harvest their organs? They're going to die one way or the other. It seems to me that more good would come of it and personal happiness if we would harvest their organs. It doesn't apply to me because I'm not a death row inmate. So again, it comes down to the way I want the world to be versus what objective morality is.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Which I think are actually the same thing. They're indistinguishable. I mean, I think the main issue here is self-sacrifice. That's the example he's talking about, the firefighters. I mean, first I'll add that firefighters don't run into burning buildings with the plan to die, normally. Usually they plan to get out alive, and they have a lot of gear and equipment and training to help them do that. But even if they're in a situation where they know they're going to die and they go in and rescue someone, they will have done it because that's the outcome they wanted. They actually chose that. They desired that outcome. Why would they do that? I mean, first of all, they might want to live in a world where people would do that. And you can't live in a world where people would do that if you're not willing to give your own life to do that. Another reason would be that they would not be able to live with themselves had they not. And this is one of the main reasons for moral self-sacrifice, is that you make a conscious decision that the world would be a better place for other people that you care about if you do a particular action that will result in your death but save other people. Now, sometimes that is a rational choice, and it makes sense because your life would simply not be worth living if you chose to do differently. But that's not always the case, and I think there are a lot of cases where moral self-sacrifice or self-sacrifice is not moral. I don't think we should have a society where we have everyone expected to give their lives for other people in every conceivable situation. I think we should have a society in which we respect the fact that people should be looking after themselves if they have to. and that we should look after each other to the extent that we can. There has to be a reasonable amount of behavior like this. We don't want, basically suicide bombers, for example, which you could talk about as being a moral self-sacrifice because they think they're making the world a better place, but they're really not. So I'll end with that.
All right, we're going to move on to our next question. Next question is coming to Lenny. I know what we'll do is, again, when a question comes, you have 2 minutes to respond to that, and then one counter response for 1 minute, and then we'll move on to the next question. Just to keep it going, we got quite a few people online here. Okay? So next question is for Lenny.
Mr. Esposito, thank you both for coming out tonight. I just had one, quick question. You kind of, Mr. Carey kind of touched on it, but you kept on coming back to, you keep saying that one half of physical brain is removed, leaving half of a physical brain, and these people have fulfilled lives, and you suggest that this is evidence that the mind isn't physical. My question is, how many bowling champions have you seen with 0 physical halves of the brain?
Well, I haven't seen any, but the doctor reported that one of the patients of his was a bowling champion. So he's reporting that.
With 0 physical halves of the brain?
Yes, he had one of his patients where they did the hemispherectomy became a bowling champion.
With no brain.
With half of a. Well, no, you're saying with both halves of his brain gone?
Yes.
Well, but what does that prove? And Richard has mentioned this. It's like saying. A car with no parts can never drive, so therefore there's no driver. See, this doesn't follow. Of course, the brain is a necessary mechanical function that interfaces between the mind and the body, but there are certain things that the mind can do that the brain, for example, if the brain was merely chemical processes, we would expect it to react to natural needs and desires, especially the most important natural needs and desires, more strenuously, such as eating or sleeping. But we all know that we can choose to go on a hunger strike, or we can choose to exercise when we really don't want to. We can choose things that override our physical desires. Where do those choices come from? That doesn't make sense that it's physical. And it begs the question to say, well, we wanted to do that. That's exactly right. Where does the want come from? Now, take away the entire brain. It doesn't work. Sure, take away your computer's hard drive. It doesn't work. But software is different than hardware, and a mind is different. Like I said, it has different properties, attitudes, desires, will. It can impose obviously it's feelings onto a body. We have psychosomatic illnesses and we use placebos all the time. The mind can affect the body, but just because you remove the function of the body or a piece of the body, that doesn't mean that the mind doesn't exist any more than if you remove the car, that doesn't mean that the driver doesn't exist.
All right. One response from Dr. Carrier.
Yeah, I mean, that begs the question. It assumes that there is a driver separate from the car, right? So you're assuming that there's some sort of soul to begin with, but that's the thing that the evidence doesn't show. If you take pieces of the brain away one by one, you slowly start to degrade the person. Their memories go, their personality abilities go, their reasoning abilities go, their ability to see goes, their ability to hear goes, and so on. Eventually, you end up with no person. That, to me, suggests that it's all a physical construct. He asks, how can we override our natural needs like eating? Well, we're not robots, actually. We've evolved a complex brain to be able to engage in innovative survival strategies. Sometimes refraining from hunger or refraining from eating is necessary for your survival, right? We had to evolve the ability to override our natural desires so that we don't start having sex in front of a tiger trying to kill us, right? So we have to actually make these kinds of decisions. Sometimes a hunter has to go hungry in order to get food, right? Where if he tries to eat immediately, he might put himself in danger or others in danger. And this is how we evolved as a social animal. We evolved the ability to override these basal desires so that we can accomplish more complex goals. And we see it throughout the animal kingdom. This is another evidence for physical stuff. As you look at the animals, the more complex the animal brain, the more complex behaviors it can engage in. And you can see it as a continuum right up to people. So,
thank you both.
All right. The next question is for Dr. Carrier. So good.
Hello. I felt you were vague with your description. If I could have more information of your atheism.
Can you be more specific? Is there something you want to know about it?
Basically, because you sounded more like a theorist. So,
like a what?
Like a theorist.
What's a theorist? I don't know what that is.
I'm sorry, if your question is not formulated, it's not a dialogue time, and so if you have a specific question for Dr. Carrier, you can ask that.
I mean, I'll answer the question that was asked. Like, what do I mean when I say I'm an atheist?
I want your more description of you being an atheist.
Okay, I'm assuming you're asking what I mean by being an atheist when I say I'm an atheist, right? Yeah. Basically, I mean, I think anyone who does not believe in a God is by definition an atheist, because atheist means without theism, without belief in God. Now, the big difference is among different atheists is what probability you assign to God. I think the probability is vastly small. I don't think it's zero. I don't think we can have absolute certainty about anything. But nevertheless, if you assign an extremely small probability to the existence of God, you're an atheist, and that's what I am.
All right. Would you like to respond to that, Lenny? Or
I believe Richard. I believe that's what he believes.
thank you. All right. Our next question is for Lenny.
The same as I felt you were vague.
Oh,
with
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just one question. Yeah. Thanks, man. Thanks for asking the question. We appreciate it. Next question is for Lenny.
Hello, Lenny. Thank you for your talk today. I have a question about the claim that you made that we can know that God exists because Jesus was resurrected from the dead. The evidence we have for that is contained in the 4 Gospels of the Bible. These are 4 stories that were written by anonymous authors. We don't know who they were. We don't know where they got their information. They're telling us what other people saw. And by the way, they're written in a different language in a different country 50, 60, 70 years after these events supposedly took place. And furthermore, they weren't claiming to be giving us sober, objective, historical accounts of what happened. As if we had a time machine and a audio or video recorder, we could actually see these things happening. So to me, it seems like rather dubious evidence to base your life upon. So the question is there any other or any good, what I'd consider good evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead?
Okay, fair enough. First of all, you have to understand the way historians, especially ancient historians, do their work. Many scholars have recognized that the format of the 4 Gospels, and by the way, those are not the only testimonies we have. We have sources that are 1 Corinthians 15, for example, is a very early source. We have Mark, we have John, we have external sources that talk about the death of Jesus, Marabon Cyprian, or Lucian, or Tacitus. There are external sources that also talk about the death of Christ beyond merely the Gospels. But when you go to do this, it's not a surprise that those that follow the person would write the biography of the person. This was true of Caesar as well. I mean, we know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon because we have one report that, and the latest extant verse we have is well beyond the 40 or 50 years that you're talking about of the Gospels. So this is not a count actually against evidence for the resurrection. It's actually a count for the resurrection. When you look at all of ancient history, the evidence that we have is really, as Dan Wallace has said, an embarrassment of riches. They've even found a scrap of Mark that he's going to start talking about that could be from the very first century. This is earlier than anything we've ever had before. To write about, say, the death of Michael Jackson now doesn't mean that I'm going to get some of those facts wrong. And when you were raised in a culture that prized long memory and oral communication, this is not, again, an argument against it. So there's a lot of evidence for Jesus. Like I said, the 3 facts that I mentioned are not contested by the vast majority of scholars, even those who don't believe in Christ, who are not Christian, who are even atheists. John Dominic Crossan, for example, of the Jesus Society. So we see these 3 facts at least as being agreed upon by everybody.
Would you like to respond to that, Dr. Carrier?
Oh, yeah. I mean, those facts don't actually entail the conclusion that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. I mean, those facts have natural explanations, and I went over that throughout the debate. There's a lot of things he mentioned in there. First of all, that we know Caesar crossed the Rubicon only from a text 40 years later is false. We have it from Caesar himself. He wrote a book in which he specifically describes crossing the Rubicon or mentions crossing the Rubicon. We have it from the letters of Cicero, who was a contemporary with Caesar and was actually alarmed by this event and wrote about it. So we have really good evidence by this. I talk about this in Sense and Goodness Without God. We're comparing the evidence for the resurrection with the evidence for Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It's right in there. You can see the difference in the sources and materials. We actually have the worst kind of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than we could possibly have for most events in ancient history. So that argument doesn't hold up.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. Carrier.
Hello. My name is Kareem Shaheen, and my question has to do, if we look at the second law of thermodynamics, we see that everything shifts towards a state of disorder or entropy. Now, if we look at life on the cellular level, the organismal level, the communal level, we see that everything is anything but disordered. Everything's ordered from protein trafficking to vesicle transport. Everything has a sense of order. So how does this come to be?
Right. Well, I mean, any biochemist can answer that question too. It's rather simple. The second law of thermodynamics says that in a state of equilibrium, or I'm sorry, in a closed system, system will move towards equilibrium. It'll become increasingly disordered. But life is not a closed system. Life is receiving energy from the sun and from its environment and so on. So it doesn't obey the second law of thermodynamics. In fact, it's an autocatalytic system that maintains itself through normal physics. And we fully understand this, the chemistry of it, the physics of it. There's nothing supernatural or amazing about it. But another important point to note is that, in fact, life only maintains itself by creating more entropy. For example, you generate a lot of heat and a lot of waste. So you are actually disorganizing the world. You're actually creating more disorder in the world, and you're using that creation of disorder to maintain the order of your body. Your cells are doing this. They're actually creating disorder in order to maintain order. So in effect, the net product is an increase in disorder. So it actually conforms to the second law of thermodynamics. There's no problem with this. I mean, no scientist would tell you that there's a problem with this.
Lenny, would you like to respond?
Well, one point that I just wanted to make, given this, there is no model of how life originated. There is no model whatsoever. We're not even close to knowing. Like I said, you have this chirality. Richard seems to say that he solved the homochirality in his book. The fact that out of millions of chances of left and right-handed amino acids, only the left ones are used, and only the right sugar phosphates are used.
Scientists have, not I didn't say that.
Okay.
As a scientist.
Well, there is no known published model of exactly how the first life formed. It just doesn't exist. And the papers that I've read in the scientific journals have said that this is a significant problem. There's just nothing in the literature to argue to that point.
All right. The next question, I believe, is for Lenny.
Yes, Lenny. Hi, Mark Smith. You stated that you believe torture to be wrong in every situation, correct?
No, I said torturing babies for fun is wrong in all situations.
Okay, given that your Bible God tortures babies, if you're of the predestination camp, why do you admire a God that does things that you would despise in a man?
Okay, I don't think that was at all clear in this debate tonight that you're making an assumption that a God would torture babies. First of all, the idea of giving life and taking life, if you're the creator of life, it's within your purview to do so. In other words, it may be wrong for me to scratch your car, but you can scratch your own car all you want because it's yours, especially if you built it. I can't chip another person's car paint, but if they built it, they can do whatever they please with it. If God is the author of life, then he can choose. It's not morally wrong for him to take life. Now, if God is all good, he may have moral sufficient reasons to do it. You're assuming that taking a child's life is somehow torturous. It is not at all clear that follows.
I'm talking about hell, torturing babies in hell for all eternity.
And it's not at all clear, and I don't necessarily believe that God sends babies to hell. I just don't believe that.
Okay, response?
Yeah, there's a large variety of different beliefs about who ends up in hell, and even what hell is, or even if there is a hell, and so on. So we didn't really get into that in this debate, so I want to dwell on it. But I do want to take issue with this claim that you can do whatever you want to someone that you create. For example, it's going to be a reality within like 50 years, certainly within 50 years, or 100 definitely, that we're going to be able to create people, androids, cyborgs. We'll actually be able to create sentient intelligences. And I think it's probably one of the worst things that we could be doing right now is promoting the idea that a creator can do whatever the hell he wants with a conscious sentient person, because we're going to be those creators. We're actually be doing this. I think if you're a compassionate person, you would not do that. And so we do not want to be in a society where we're going to do that, not least because they could turn on us, obviously. If we're forcing them to be tortured slaves in our society, well, they have the opportunity then to rebel and make us the same thing. But if we want to live in a world where we're going to get along with these intelligences that we'll create, we better treat them the way we want them to treat us. It's a basic, simple mathematics. And I think if God has any compassion, if he even has the same compassion I do, and I'm not like an infinitely moral, perfect being, But unless he's less moral than me, certainly he's going to stop a rape in progress, for example. Certainly he's not going to allow people to go to hell. He's going to give every conceivable way to prevent that from happening. He wouldn't even allow there to be a hell. It's a stupid idea. I don't even know why it would even come up. Certainly an infinite hell. I mean, that's massively illogical. A compassionate person is not going to do this. So I think it's a valid criticism of the underlying disturbing elements of certain aspects of Christianity where we're justifying horrific behavior by God. If we maintain this, we're going to be able to use those justifications to do horrific things ourselves in the future, and I don't think we should be doing that. So you need to think reflectively about whether giving excuses to God is really a good idea.
Forgive us, but due to respect of time and also to the school, UCR here, we're only going to be able to take 2 more questions from each side. I know, guys. That both speakers will be at the tables. If you'd like to give them a note, or if you'd like, to correspond in email, I'm sure they would definitely do that with you. Or you can talk to them right there at the table. But again, we'll do 2 questions from each side. And again, we just want to respect the time here that UCR has given us. Okay. So we are. Question is going to Dr. Carrier.
My question is, which set is larger, set A or B, where A is the sum of the number of rotations in every single one of your possible worlds or infinite worlds or many worlds in the past, and B is the number of rotations for in each world that has the least number of rotations. So A is the largest possible rotations. A planet orbits the sun the most times, and B is the least times. Given an infinite past, which set is greater, A or B?
I have no idea what you're even asking or why it's relevant to this debate.
Would you mind clarifying?
The reason why it's important, because if it's infinite past, then A and B are actually equal, because infinity is equal to infinity.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, well, this is an issue with transfinite mathematics. Infinities can be equal to each other like this. This is because transfinite mathematics obeys different rules than finite arithmetic. If you want to study this, you can look into Cantorian studies of how infinite numbers behave differently than finite numbers. And in fact, there are different infinities. There are infinities that are larger than other infinities. There actually are. It's called cardinality. If you look up infinity, cardinality in Google, you'll learn all about how there are infinities that actually aren't equal to other infinities. But the fact that they're equal only means that they're both uncountable, or uncountable is the wrong word, but they both don't have a highest number, essentially. So you're expecting these infinities to obey finite arithmetic rules, and they don't. But anyway, that doesn't prevent them from occurring or existing. It just means that we can't do the same mathematical operations on them that we do with others.
Lenny, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I guess I would. It kind of brings back the point that we've talked about before. Yes, you can do mathematical calculations on the square root of -1. You can use it to solve problems. It doesn't mean that you can have the square root of -1 pieces of pie in front of you. And I think that's the point that we're trying to express here. Is actual infinites, trans-mathematical numbers, don't obey the laws that we would expect in a physical world, because they are not physical. They're something different. They're like I said, boundless sets. But a boundless set is a concept. It can't exist in reality. And it leads to these logical or illogical conclusions as the questioner is posing. So.
All right, we'll have 2 more questions for Lenny and 1 more question for Dr. Carrier. Lenny?
Okay, my main thing is your point is God exists because the universe is finely tuned. Dr. Carrier mentioned there's a possibility there be an infinite amount of universes where the physics isn't finely tuned and there might not be life. Mm-hmm. That being said, if that's a possibility, is it possible in those universes where it's not finely tuned that God does not exist?
It's a fair question. No, actually. The point of fine-tuning is saying that at least, first of all, the idea of an infinite amount of universes, as I've argued, and again, it's easy to dismiss both the Dyson paper and the Vilenkin paper. I noticed that Richard actually appealed to chaotic inflation theory. Well, that's Vilenkin's theory. He invented it. So the fact that he's appealing to it, I would think that he would also hold Vilenkin up in his idea that there has to be a finite past. You can't choose chaotic inflation without a finite past. They both come from the same guy. But to that question, I didn't merely use finely tuning. I used 6 lines of evidence. The biggest one is that we are here. Why is there something rather than nothing at all?
Right.
And so that's
my question was on a finely tuned universe.
Yeah.
If it's possible for there not to be a finely tuned universe, is it possible in that
Yeah, I think
undefined
Paul,
universe,
I think
there's no God.
No, Paul Davies said that if, and here's the argument, that if it was just random, we would expect there to be either mass chaos or a completely boring set. Neither one of those proves there is no God, but a finely tuned universe is evidence that there is a God, and that's the point.
Thank you.
Okay, would you like to respond to that, Dr. Carrier?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that's relevant to my position in this is that, first of all, I didn't say chaotic inflation is necessarily true. I offered it as a possible theory that many cosmologists believe. In fact, it's probably one of the most dominant theories in cosmology today. And this idea that if Vilenkin came up with it, therefore he can never be wrong about anything else ever is kind of silly. So I just want to point that out, is that just the fact that Vilenkin is one of the people that was involved in developing chaotic inflation theory doesn't mean that every paper he writes is true or that every cosmologist agrees with everything else he said. That is not the case.
All right, the next question is for Dr. Carrier. This is the final question for Dr. Carrier. Yes.
Hey, Mr. Carrier. My question is, why are there any physical and natural laws at all in the first place? A lot of your explanations are given time and chemistry sets, stuff happens. I want to know, why is there even any laws in the first place?
Right. That's a big question because there are a lot of different kinds of physical laws, and they all have different causes. To give you an example, the existence. Why is there gravity, for example, and why does gravity obey the laws that it does? This can be reduced to the fact that there are gravitons and that there are mass particles that exchange gravitons and so on. So it's the existence of the particles and the existence of the space in which they operate. You have the particles and their properties, you have the space and its properties, the laws emerge as an inevitable consequence of their combination. So what you want to explain is, where do the particles come from? And that's where chaotic inflation and quantum vacuum theory and all these other what actual physical cosmologists posit as theories and possibilities for where these things came from. That's where they're getting the idea. And when you look at cosmology, look at throughout the entire field of cosmological science, the God hypothesis is not in there. All of their hypotheses are all physical hypotheses, and they're aiming to explain things like this. One of the popular ones now, but we haven't been able to prove it yet or even test it, is superstring theory. Superstring theory argues that everything is reducible to space-time. So if you twist up space-time a certain way, you get an electron. And in fact, what an electron is only a knot in space-time. So really, that reduces all physical laws to just the way space-time is shaped, and it's really reduced then to geometry, which is very fascinating. And I think there's a lot of prospect there for the future explanation of physics. But this is, there's a lot of different physical laws. Some of them have been explained. Others, scientists are still working on it. I think the trends are pretty clear as to where we're going to end up with those. We just don't have the full final theory of everything yet, but we're on our way.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, again, I think to your point, well, okay, you have gravitons, you have the particles, and these laws just emerged, but where did the gravitons come from? Where did the space come from? Richard talks about superstring theory. Well, where did the strings themselves come from? How do you can't twist up space-time if space and time are two of the things you're trying to explain are coming into existence. You're saying that they already exist, now you twist them up and you get other things. Well, that's not a good explanation. To Richard's other point, and he's made this claim a couple of times, that if you have nothing, there's no laws, therefore anything can happen. That's not true. If you have nothing, then no thing can happen. That's what nothing is. It's no thing. It's the absence of all other things. It is Richard says that you have to prove, I have to prove that there is a God, but he doesn't because he believes in no God. Well, I'm saying if there's no thing, you don't get something popping out of nothing. What's there to pop? How can something pop when there's not a thing there to begin with? It doesn't make sense, and philosophers have understood this for time immemorial. David Albert just took Lawrence Krauss's book to task in a recent review, saying Lawrence Krauss has no idea what he's talking about because you can't pop nothing into existence. And that's the problem we have here. He's redefining nothing to mean something different.
Right, this will be the final question of the night for Lenny.
Yes, my name is Richard. This question is for Lenny. Lenny, for more or less convinced that God exists, is it also safe to assume that the Jewish God exists, the Muslim God exists, the Hindu God exists, the Egyptian God exists?
That's a great question. And what you do is, you're right. My argument, with the possible exception of the last point, the other 5 evidences don't necessarily point to the Christian God. With the last point, it does. However, what it does point to is a mind who is immaterial, who is distinct from space, who is transcendent. He's above his created order, and that would eliminate things like Taoism, Buddhism. Occam's razor would come into play, where you start talking about multiple gods, and that would eliminate things like Hinduism. Then you look at claims of religions, say like Islam, and you can compare the cohesive or the cognitive idea of the Muslim God versus the Christian God. You can basically jump into your investigation from that point forward. So all I was arguing tonight is that God does exist. But it just doesn't mean that because God exists, we need to accept every version of God. I know the claim is made, well, an atheist, you're an atheist too. You just believe in one more God than I do. That's a silly claim, though. That's like saying, well, you believe in 2 + 2 is 4, but there's millions of answers. You just believe in, one more answer than I do. It just because there's one right answer doesn't mean that the answer isn't right. And that's the way I make that claim. So.
And a final response from Dr. Carrier.
My only objection to anything that he said there is this idea that Taoism wouldn't work as an explanation. In fact, Taoism posits a simpler entity than God. Remember, God, you're talking about a mind that's far more complex than a human mind, right? Like I pointed out, we're talking about 10 to the power of 5 million is a specified complexity of something like a monkey brain or something of that level. A human brain is vastly more complex than that, and the brain is necessary. The complexity of the brain correlates with the complexity of the mind. So if you have a mind, even if there's no brain, if it's just some sort of supernatural mind that has no material basis, you still have to have all the thoughts and reasoning abilities connected up the same way to have the intelligence. So a God is actually a vastly complicated and therefore highly improbable entity to propose, if all the gods that you could get. Now, if you were to pick gods at random, you'd actually more likely get something like the Tao, which is more like a vegetable mind. In the Taoist teachings, it's not intelligent, but has certain behaviors and instincts that results in bringing about the universe. And in fact, Taoists predicted something like the Big Bang Theory, or you'd have the progression of animals or entities and animals over time, so that things would build complexity over time rather than all instantaneously, right? So Taoism requires a much simpler entity. It's actually much more likely, if there's a supernatural cause of the universe, that it would be something like Tao, or the Taoist concept, than these really massively complicated superintelligences.
All right, that's going to conclude our Q&A at this time. Let's give a hand for the speakers. We want to thank you again for coming out to the Great God Debate. Have a wonderful night. Thank you very much.